The wailing wind carried Martha Ellery's desperate whisper across the dusty yard of her once prosperous ranch. "I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother," she said, her voice breaking as she faced the tall Apache warrior standing in the shadow of her barn. 2 months had passed since her husband Thomas had left, declaring to all of Cold Harrow that she was barren as the winter hills. The shame still burned in her chest like swallowed fire, but desperation had long since consumed her pride. Ahiv studied the white woman's face, noting the steel beneath her tears. He had come only to trade pelts for supplies, not expecting to hear an offer that violated every boundary between their worlds. Behind him, 50 head of prime cattle lowed softly in the twilight, representing more wealth than most men would see in a lifetime. Martha's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 28, she had already been written off by Cold Harrow society as a failure, a woman who couldn't fulfill her most basic purpose. Her reputation lay in ruins, scattered like autumn leaves by Thomas's public humiliation of her. What more could she lose by making such an unholy bargain? "They will hate you more than they already do," Ahiv said finally, his English careful and deliberate. He had learned their language during his years of solitary wandering after raiders had slaughtered his family and scattered his band when he was barely 20. Now 30, he carried the wisdom of survival and the weight of loss in equal measure. The woman before him carried a different kind of emptiness, but he recognized the hollow look in her eyes. A lantern flickered in the window of Orrin Talbert's ranch house across the valley, a constant reminder of the neighbor who had already made offers for her land, offers that grew more insistent with each passing week. Martha knew the whispers that followed her through town. A woman alone couldn't manage a ranch, couldn't protect her cattle, couldn't survive without a man's protection. The merchants had already begun treating her with the polite condescension reserved for lost causes. 1 year. Martha said, straightening her spine and meeting the Apache's dark eyes directly. "Stay 1 year, give me a child, and everything I own becomes yours." She gestured toward the cattle, the modest house, the barn that needed repair, unaware that this desperate bargain would ignite a conflict that would consume all of Cold Harrow. Ahiv stood silent for a long moment, the proposition hanging in the air between them like smoke. His people had traditions, beliefs about creating life, that made such an arrangement complex beyond the white woman's understanding. Yet he too was alone in this world, cut adrift from his tribe after the massacre that had spared only him. The cattle would mean security, a chance to rebuild something from the ashes of his former life. "There's food inside," Martha said, gesturing toward the small cabin. "You should eat while you consider my offer." Her voice had steadied now, taking on the businesslike tone of a woman who had managed a ranch alone since Thomas had ridden away on that spring morning without a backward glance. The inside of the cabin was neat but sparse, bearing witness to Martha's solitude. A single plate sat on the wooden table, a single cup beside the coffee pot, a single chair pulled up to the hearth. The marks of Thomas's presence had been methodically erased, as if he had never existed in this space. Ahiv ate the stew she offered, watching as she busied herself at the stove, her back rigid with pride or fear, perhaps both. "Your husband," he said finally. "He left because there was no child." Martha's voice was flat as the prairie beyond her window. 6 years of marriage, 6 years of what he called failure. She turned to face him, her brown eyes hard with remembered humiliation. "The doctor in Cold Harrow said there was nothing wrong with either of us, just ill fortune." The town had watched with barely concealed interest as the Ellery marriage crumbled. Women who had once invited Martha to sewing circles began crossing the street to avoid speaking to her. Men who had once respectfully removed their hats in her presence now eyed her property with calculation. 3 months ago, he announced to everyone in the general store that I was defective. Martha continued, her fingers gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles whitened. 2 weeks later, he sold his half of the cattle to Orrin Talbert and rode out with a dance hall girl from Tucson. Outside, a coyote called to its kin across the darkening range, a lonely sound that seemed to pierce the walls of the cabin. Ahiv had heard the stories about Martha Ellery in town, whispered with malicious delight when he traded his pelts. The barren woman abandoned and disgraced, too stubborn to sell her land to Talbert and move away. My people believe that children come when the ancestors decide, Ahiv said, setting down his spoon. Not when men and women demand it. He had never fathered a child, had never expected to, after the destruction of his band left him drifting between two worlds belonging to neither. Martha poured coffee into 2 cups, a small gesture of civility in the midst of their impossible negotiation. I don't care about ancestors or God or whatever decides such things, she said. I care about legacy, about not disappearing from this earth as if I never existed. Talbert had made no secret of his plans for Martha's land once he acquired it. He would clear the native grasses that had sustained her carefully managed herd, replacing them with crops that would deplete the soil within a decade. Her cattle descended from her grandfather's original stock would be slaughtered and replaced with his own inferior breeds. If I stay, Ahiv said carefully, the town will turn against you even more. He had seen how the settlers treated women who crossed the invisible boundaries of their society, how they treated Indians who dared to claim equality. They might come with guns and torches. Martha laughed a sharp sound without humor. Let them come. What more can they take from me? My reputation's already gone. My place in society was forfeit the moment Thomas walked out that door. She pushed a cup toward him across the rough wooden table. At least this way I choose my fate. Ahiv left Martha's cabin at dawn, promising to return with his decision in 3 days' time. The proposition weighed on him as he rode toward the foothills where he had made a temporary camp among the juniper trees. No tribe would accept what he contemplated, lying with a white woman trading his seed for cattle. His father had been a respected medicine man, before the massacre teaching Ahiv the sacred ways of healing and communion with the spirits. These teachings now haunted his solitary existence, reminders of obligations he could never fulfill without his people. The old ways demanded continuity, community, the passing of knowledge through generations. Yet what use were traditions to a man with no one to teach them to? The small cave where he had been living offered shelter, but not home. Pelts from his hunting were stacked neatly against one wall. His few possessions were arranged with the precision of a man who had learned that order was one thing he could still control in a chaotic world that had taken everything else from him. As darkness fell on the first night, Aishev built a small fire and sought guidance through the sacred smoke, sending messages through ancient networks to distant Apache bands. If trouble came, he would need allies. The spirits of his ancestors seemed distant, unreachable across the divide of his isolation. Had they abandoned him as thoroughly as Martha Ellery's husband had abandoned her? By the second day, Ahiv had begun to see Martha's offer differently, not as a transaction of flesh, but as an alliance against a shared enemy extinction. The cattle were valuable, yes, but what use was wealth to a man with no family, no future, no place in either the white or Apache world? He remembered the old stories told around tribal fires, of how the first Apache had come into being through unexpected unions, of how survival sometimes required new paths, unforeseen by tradition. His grandmother would say that when old trails disappeared, new ones must be made, even if they led through dangerous country. The third day dawned with clarity. Ahiv packed his few belongings and mounted his horse, decision made. The cattle would provide a foundation, something to build upon in this world that had left him adrift. Perhaps the white woman's emptiness and his own might together create something whole. Martha was checking fence lines when she saw Ahiv approaching across the eastern pasture. Her heart quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral as he dismounted. She had spent 3 days alternating between hope and despair, between pragmatic planning and midnight doubts. I have considered your offer, Ahiv said without preamble. I will stay for 1 year, as you asked. His dark eyes held hers steadily, unembellished honesty in his gaze. But there must be conditions beyond what you proposed. Martha nodded cautiously, her sun-browned hands stilling on the fence wire she had been tightening. She had expected negotiations. Even in this most unconventional of arrangements, there would be terms to settle. What conditions? She asked. I will not be a servant or a shadow, Ahiv said firmly. If I stay, I work the ranch as a partner, not a hired hand. I make decisions about the cattle alongside you. His people had been pushed aside, diminished, treated as less than human for too long. He would not accept such treatment, even for the promise of wealth. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp eyes seeking movement in the grass below, patient in its hunting. Martha felt a similar patience would be required of her. Agreed, she said after a moment's consideration. But the deed remains in my name until the child is born. If there is no child after a year, you still get the cattle as promised. There is more. Ahiv continued, gesturing toward the distant town. Your people will not accept this arrangement. They will try to drive me away. Maybe try to hurt you. He had seen how the settlers protected what they considered the purity of their women, how they reacted to any crossing of boundaries between white and native. Martha's laugh was brittle like dry grass underfoot. Let them try. Cold Harrow already treats me like a leper. What's one more reason for them to cross the street when they see me coming? She tightened the last wire with a vicious twist. Talbert is the real threat. He wants this land, and he's not particular about how he gets it. They walked together toward the cabin, an awkward distance between them, both acutely aware of the strangeness of their arrangement. We should put our agreement in writing, Martha said pragmatically, so there can be no misunderstandings later. She had learned from her marriage the danger of assumptions, of expectations left unspoken. Inside, Martha took paper from a drawer and carefully wrote out their terms, while Ahiv watched silently. 2 signatures at the bottom, hers in neat penmanship, learned at a Boston ladies' school, his in the careful block letters taught by a missionary before his tribe scattered to the winds. A contract unlike any other in the Arizona Territory. We begin tonight, Martha said, setting down her pen with deliberate calm. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs, but she would not show fear or hesitation. She had initiated this arrangement. She would see it through with dignity. The southeast bedroom is yours. My room is across the hall. Ahiv nodded once, accepting both the practical arrangement and the implication of their more intimate agreement. I will bring my things, he said simply, and stepped outside to retrieve the bundle from his horse. This strange partnership had begun. For better or worse, news would spread quickly once he was seen living at the Ellery Ranch. Martha knew the whispers would start by sundown, would reach the town. By morning would become outraged gossip by midday tomorrow. Sheriff Lockridge would likely ride out by afternoon, concerned about impropriety or worse. The next months will not be easy. Ahiv said when he returned, standing awkwardly in the cabin that was now partly his home. The space seemed to shrink with his presence, the air charged with the enormity of what they had agreed to for either of us. Martha straightened her shoulders at the same determination in her stance that had first made Ahiv consider her proposal. Nothing worthwhile ever is, she replied, and moved to prepare the evening meal, their first shared supper as conspirators in this dangerous new alliance. Word spread through Cold Harrow like wildfire on dry prairie. By Sunday morning, the church pews buzzed with whispers as Martha entered, her head high, Ahiv conspicuously absent. She had insisted on attending services despite knowing what awaited her. Better to face the gossip directly than hide from it. Deacon Hurst watched her progress down the aisle with narrowed eyes, his thin lips pressed into a bloodless line. The morning sermon had been hastily rewritten, Martha suspected, as the preacher's gaze never left her face, while he spoke of Jezebel and moral corruption of women who defied God's natural order. The congregation shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden pews, some staring openly at Martha, others deliberately avoiding her gaze. Harriet Wilson, who had been Martha's friend since childhood, slid away when Martha sat beside her, leaving a conspicuous gap that spoke volumes about her new status in the community. Wickedness comes in many forms. Deacon Hurst thundered from his pulpit, sweat beading on his high forehead despite the morning chill. Sometimes it masquerades as necessity, as pragmatism, as survival. His finger pointed directly at Martha, who stared back unflinching. But God is not fooled by such disguises. After the service, Martha stood alone in the churchyard as families gathered in tight clusters, conversation dying whenever she approached. Children were pulled away from her path as if her presence might contaminate them with some moral disease. Only old Mrs. Gunderson, nearly blind and dependent on no one's good opinion, stopped to speak with her. "They're scared of you now." The elderly woman whispered, her gnarled hand gripping Martha's arm with surprising strength. "You've done what they secretly fear. You've chosen your own path, instead of withering away, according to their expectations." Her cloudy eyes seemed to see more clearly than anyone else's in Cold Harrow. Sheriff Vernon Lockridge waited until Monday afternoon to ride out to the Ellery Ranch, his official visit delayed by reluctance, rather than more pressing matters. He found Martha and Ahiv repairing the South Corral, working side by side with the easy rhythm of longtime partners rather than new acquaintances. "Mrs. Ellery." The sheriff began awkwardly, hat in hand, eyes darting between Martha and the Apache. "There have been concerns expressed by certain citizens regarding your current living arrangement." His discomfort was palpable as his horse shifted beneath him, sensing its rider's unease. Martha drove a fence nail with unnecessary force, the hammer striking metal with a sharp ring that seemed to echo across the pasture. "I wasn't aware that Cold Harrow had passed new ordinances regarding who property owners may employ or house on their land, Sheriff. Perhaps you could cite the specific law being broken." Lockridge cleared his throat, his weathered face flushing beneath his tan. "It's not a matter of law exactly, ma'am. More a question of propriety." He couldn't quite meet her eyes as he fumbled for the right words. "A woman alone with an Apache," Ahiv supplied calmly, his voice cutting through the sheriff's discomfort like a blade. He set down his tools and faced Lockridge directly, his dignity a silent challenge to the assumptions behind the lawman's visit. "Or is it that I am a man, regardless of my people?" The visitors continued throughout the week. Deacon Hurst with biblical admonitions, Harriet Wilson with tearful pleas about Martha's reputation. Several ranchers with thinly veiled threats about maintaining standards in the territory. Each departed unsatisfied, finding Martha immovable and Ahiv a silent, watchful presence at her side. By Friday, Martha noticed the first signs of active hostility rather than mere disapproval. The general store owner claimed to be out of supplies she regularly purchased, forcing her to ride an extra 10 miles to the next settlement. The blacksmith suddenly doubled his prices for her work, claiming increased costs for materials. "They hope to starve us out," Martha observed that evening as they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The cabin no longer felt empty with Ahiv's presence. His quiet strength filled the spaces that had echoed with loneliness since Thomas left. "Make life difficult enough that we'll give up and leave." Orrin Talbert watched the growing controversy from his sprawling ranch house with calculated interest. The scandal surrounding Martha Ellery's arrangement with the Apache served his purposes perfectly. The more isolated she became, the more vulnerable her position when he made his move to acquire her land. Patience. He counseled his foreman, a hard-eyed man named Fletcher, who had suggested more direct action. Let Cold Harrow do our work for us. Talbot stroked his carefully trimmed beard eyes, narrowed as he gazed across the valley toward the Ellery Ranch. Social pressure can accomplish what money cannot. Fletcher nodded reluctantly, knowing his employer's reputation for getting what he wanted without sullying his own hands. Talbot had built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties through a combination of shrewd business and carefully applied pressure, legal or otherwise, depending on what the situation required. The land Martha Ellery stubbornly clung to was the missing piece in Talbot's empire. Controlling the water rights to Cottonwood Creek would give him leverage over every smaller ranch for 20 miles. The previous year's drought had demonstrated how valuable those water rights could become in the increasingly crowded territory. In the shadows of Talbot's barn, 3 men gathered who would never be invited into the main house, hired guns with no local connections. They listened impassively as Fletcher outlined their role in the coming weeks. Subtle intimidation at first, escalating as needed, but nothing that could be traced back to Talbot's door. "The Indian complicates things," muttered the oldest of the 3, a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. "Apaches have ways of knowing when danger approaches." He had fought against Cochise's warriors in his younger days, earning both respect and wariness for his adversaries. Meanwhile, in town, Deacon Hurst was organizing a different kind of opposition, a prayer circle for the soul of Martha Ellery. He called it, though, the meetings in the church basement focused less on spiritual salvation and more on practical methods of driving the unholy union from their midst. Sheriff Lockridge found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the growing tensions. He had known Martha since she first arrived, as a bride had watched her work the ranch with determination after Thomas abandoned her. The law offered no grounds to interfere with her private arrangements, yet the pressure from Cold Harrow's leading citizens mounted daily. "There's talk of a committee to visit the Ellery place." Bernard Miller, the bank manager, informed Talbot over brandy at the town's only hotel. Concerned citizens making their disapproval known in person. His jowly face flushed with the excitement of conspiracy, the small-town banker hungry for inclusion in what he perceived as the inner circle of power. Talbot feigned reluctance, playing his part with practiced skill. "Violence is never the answer, Bernard," he murmured, swirling amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Though I understand the community's moral outrage." His false concern masked the satisfaction he felt as his carefully planted suggestions took root in fertile ground. The Apache was the wild card in Talbot's calculations. Stories of Ahive's fighting prowess had reached town, how he had once killed 3 men who attacked him on the trail to Santa Fe. How he moved like a shadow through terrain where white men stumbled blindly. A formidable opponent, but one man alone could not stand against a determined community. Unknown to Talbot, Ahive had been watching his ranch from distant ridgelines, counting men and horses, noting routines and weaknesses with the patient eye of a warrior, trained since childhood to observe enemy camps. He recognized the gathering storm, had seen similar patterns before raids on Apache villages. "Your neighbor builds an army," Ahive told Martha as they checked cattle in the north pasture far from any listening ears. "Not soldiers in uniform, but men with guns who stay in the bunkhouse but do no ranch work." His keen eyes had counted 7 such men arriving over the past week, hardened fighters with the weary movements of predators. Martha nodded grimly, unsurprised by the news. "Talbot always uses others to do his dirty work," she said, adjusting her hat against the glaring sun. "He wants my water rights more than the land itself." The spring-fed creek running through her property remained reliable even in drought years, making it invaluable in the arid territory. As autumn painted the surrounding hills with gold and crimson, Martha and Ahive settled into an unexpected rhythm of coexistence. Their initial awkwardness gave way to a practical partnership during daylight hours, mending fences, tending cattle, preparing for the coming winter. The nights remained separate, a silent agreement to build trust, before fulfilling the more intimate aspects of their arrangement. Ahive taught Martha to read the land in ways her Eastern education had never prepared her for. He showed her how to find hidden springs by observing the subtle changes in vegetation, how to predict storms 3 days before they arrived, by watching the behavior of animals and the patterns of clouds over distant mountains. "Your cattle are managed poorly," he observed bluntly one morning as they rode the perimeter of the north pasture. "Too many in one area eating all the good grass, leaving the land wounded." He dismounted to show her how the soil had compacted, explaining the Apache way of moving herds frequently to allow the earth to heal itself. Martha swallowed her initial defensiveness, recognizing the wisdom in his criticism. These were techniques no rancher in Cold Harrow practiced, yet they made perfect sense in this arid country, where recovery from overgrazing could take decades. Together, they developed a new system dividing the herds into smaller groups rotated through different pastures. In turn, Martha shared her knowledge of record-keeping and market condition skills Ahiv had never needed in his former life. She taught him to read the cattle market reports in week-old newspapers, explained how to calculate profit margins, and plan for lean seasons. These were survival skills of a different sort, necessary in the white man's world commerce. The cabin gradually transformed with their shared occupancy. Ahiv's craftsmanship appeared in new furniture, a rocking chair carved from cottonwood shelves fitted perfectly into kitchen corners, a work table that didn't wobble. Martha's touch softened his utilitarian designs with small comforts cushions, curtains the scent of baking bread. Sheriff Lockridge made his third visit in as many weeks this time with reluctant news. "There's talk in town of refusing to sell you supplies," he admitted, uncomfortable with his role as messenger. "The mercantile, the feed store, even the doctor. They're being pressured to cut ties." His weathered face showed genuine concern beneath his official neutrality. Martha took this news with outward calm, though her hands tightened on the coffee cup she offered the lawman. "And who's behind this pressure, Sheriff? Or should I not bother asking?" The question was rhetorical. Talbert's influence extended into every business in Cold Harrow through loans, investments, or more direct methods of persuasion. What surprised both Martha and the sheriff was Ahiv's response. "We will trade elsewhere," he stated, simply joining the conversation from the doorway. "The Navajo to the north, the Mexican settlements to the south, both will sell to us." His network of connections outside white society, built during years of solitary wandering, now offered alternatives that Talbert couldn't control. As predicted, the Cold Harrow merchants began refusing Martha's business the following week. The feed store owner couldn't meet her eyes, as he claimed to be out of stock. The general store suddenly required cash instead of the credit arrangements extended to every other rancher in the territory. Only the blacksmith, old Gus Hansen, defied the boycott, still accepting her horses for shoeing. "My father was shunned in Norway for marrying my mother," Hansen explained gruffly when Martha thanked him. "Came to America to escape such foolishness, not to repeat it." His gnarled hands continued working as he spoke, hammering red-hot metal with practiced precision. "Besides, Talbert owes me money 3 months past due. Let him take his business elsewhere if he doesn't like mine." 2 days after Hansen's declaration of independence, his forge mysteriously caught fire overnight. Though the town quickly organized to save the surrounding buildings, the blacksmith shop burned to the ground, leaving only scorched stone and twisted metal. The message was unmistakable to anyone who might consider supporting the Ellery Ranch. Meanwhile, as October yielded to November, Martha noticed changes in her body, subtle shifts that she scarcely dared acknowledge, even to herself. Her monthly cycle, regular as the moon since girlhood, failed to appear. Her breasts felt tender. Certain foods suddenly turned her stomach. Hope bloomed cautiously, too fragile yet to share, even with Ahiv. The first frost gilded the grasslands surrounding the Ellery Ranch, transforming the landscape overnight into a crystalline wonderland that crackled underfoot. Martha rose before dawn as usual, but found herself suddenly dizzy upon standing, forced to grip the bedpost until the sensation passed. The morning sickness that followed confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Their arrangement had borne fruit more quickly than anticipated. Ahive noticed the changes in Martha before she spoke of them and the pallor that sometimes washed over her face in the mornings. The food she now avoided, the protective way her hand occasionally drifted to her abdomen when she thought no one was watching. He said nothing respecting her privacy, but began taking on more of the physical labor, without comment or complaint. When Martha finally shared her news one evening as they sat before the fire, Ahive's response surprised her. Instead of the businesslike acknowledgement she expected, confirmation that their contract was proceeding as planned, his face softened with something like wonder. "My grandmother would say your body honors our agreement before our minds have fully accepted it," he said quietly. Their momentary peace shattered the next morning when they discovered 3 of their best breeding cows dead in the east pasture, their throats cut with surgical precision. No predator had done this. It was a warning, a demonstration of vulnerability. Talbert's patience was clearly wearing thin. The water came next. Their creek running suddenly cloudy one morning, carrying the stench of coal oil and something more sinister that made the cattle refuse to drink. Abe rode upstream until he found the source barrels deliberately tipped into the water at the point where it entered Martha's property, their contents designed to poison slowly rather than kill outright. Frodibal, they hoped to weaken the herd, make them sickly before winter fully arrives. Ahive explained as they worked to dam the contaminated section and divert clean water around it. His understanding of watershed management, learned from childhood in arid lands where water was sacred, proved invaluable as they labored through the day to save their livelihood. Martha's pregnancy complicated matters in unexpected ways. Though still in its early stages, the condition limited her ability to assist with certain ranch tasks, particularly as the morning sickness intensified. Yet it also created a new urgency in their planning. This child would need protection from forces gathering against its very existence. Sheriff Lockridge appeared again this time with genuine alarm rather than bureaucratic discomfort. "Talbert's brought in more men," he reported, accepting the coffee Martha offered with a grateful nod. "Hard cases from down El Paso way. Not cowboys, but fighters. I've sent telegrams asking about some of them. The replies mentioned wanted posters." The information confirmed Ahive's observations from his regular scouting expeditions. 15 men now, he told Martha after the sheriff departed. They practice with rifles each morning at dawn. His expression remained neutral, but Martha had learned to read the subtle signs of his concern and the slight tension around his eyes, the measured precision of his movements. Unexpectedly, allies began to emerge from unlikely quarters. Old Mrs. Gunderson sent her grandson under cover of darkness with a wagon of preserved foods and medical supplies. "Grandmother says babies need special care," the boy whispered wide-eyed at his clandestine mission. "And she says Mr. Talbert is a jackal who'll get what's coming to him." 2 Navajo traders, hearing of the situation through Ahive's connections, detoured to the ranch with goods they would normally sell in town. "We know what it is to be unwelcome," the elder of the pair commented dryly. "Your money is as good as any other." Their appearance established a new supply line, independent of Cold Harrow's embargo. More surprising was the arrival of Gus Hansen, the blacksmith, his tools salvaged from the ashes of his shop loaded in a mule-drawn wagon. "Thought you might need some metal work done," he announced without preamble. "And I find myself temporarily without a forge in town." His arrival represented more than practical assistance. It was open defiance of Talbert's campaign. Ahive constructed hidden observation posts at strategic points around the property, enabling them to monitor approaches from any direction. He taught Martha to use signal mirrors to recognize the difference between ordinary dust clouds and those raised by approaching riders, to distinguish between the sounds of natural night movements and human intruders. The first direct attack came on a moonless night in early December. 3 riders attempting to stampede a section of the herd through a cut fence line. They might have succeeded if not for Ahive's warning system of carefully placed trip lines connected to small bells. The would-be rustlers fled when confronted, but everyone knew they would return with greater numbers and determination. Winter settled fully over the territory, blanketing the land in silence, broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle in their sheltered pastures. Martha's pregnancy began to show, her dresses loosened to accommodate the gentle swell of new life. The child grew as steadily as the tension surrounding the ranch, both reaching toward an inevitable culmination. Ahive found himself touching the ceremonial medicine pouch he wore beneath his shirt, with increasing frequency, a connection to ancestral wisdom in uncertain times. Inside were sacred items, eagle feather white shell pollen, that should have been used in blessing ceremonies for his people's children. Now, against all expectation, he contemplated performing such rituals for his own child. The practical nature of their arrangement had shifted imperceptibly over the months of shared danger and purpose. Martha noticed it first in small gestures, Ahive bringing her tea made from herbs, he gathered, before she asked, his hand steadying her elbow on icy ground, the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. My people believe that a child chooses its parents before birth, Ahive explained one evening as they sat before the fire, Martha's knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a small blanket. The spirit watches many moons, selecting those who will teach what it needs to learn in this world. His voice held a reverence that transcended their original bargain. Martha's hands stilled her eyes, reflecting firelight as she considered his words. Then this child has chosen a difficult path, she observed. Neither fully of your world nor mine. The society that had rejected her would be even less forgiving of a mixed-blood child, while the scattered Apache bands might view the child with similar suspicion. Or perhaps it chooses to build a bridge between worlds. Ahive countered his usual stoicism, softened by something Martha had never seen before: hope. My grandmother spoke of such children born of different bloods, who could see with multiple visions, speak with multiple tongues. Powerful medicine, she called it. The winter solstice arrived, marked by the year's longest night. Ayasev disappeared before dawn, returning at dusk with juniper branches and sage. Without explanation, he built a small fire outside, inviting Martha to join him beneath the emerging stars. Tonight, our child's spirit is strongest, he said simply. We should honor its courage. Martha watched in silent wonder as Ahive sang softly in his native tongue, words she couldn't understand, but whose meaning she somehow felt. He placed her hands on her growing belly, covering them with his own, as he offered prayers to the four directions. The ritual completed something in her that Eastern religion had never touched: a connection to the land itself. The following morning, Martha woke to find a carefully carved wooden cradle beside her bed, its surfaces adorned with symbols of protection and strength. Ahive said nothing when she thanked him, merely nodding acknowledgement. But the gift spoke volumes about his changing relationship to their unborn child, no longer a transaction, but a legacy. In the quiet weeks that followed, Martha began teaching Ahive to read English beyond the basic words he already knew. He proved a quick study, hungry for knowledge that had been denied him, spending evenings poring over her small collection of books with the same intensity he brought to tracking game or reading weather signs. Knowledge is the one thing they cannot take from us, Martha observed as Ahive successfully read an entire page from her mother's old poetry book. Land, cattle, reputation, all can be stolen or destroyed, but what we know remains. Her hands rested protectively over her growing child, the embodiment of their combined knowledge and heritage. As January gave way to February, bringing slightly longer days but deeper cold, they developed a new evening ritual. Ahive would recount Apache stories of creation and transformation, tales passed through generations by spoken word, while Martha shared books from her childhood: myths of ancient Greece, Aesop's fables, Shakespeare's plays, simplified for young readers. What neither acknowledged directly was how their sleeping arrangements had gradually changed. The bitter cold had first brought Ahive to sleep, before the hearth in Martha's room for protection, and then eventually beside her for warmth. Physical necessity, had evolved into emotional comfort and the simple human need for connection, transcending cultural boundaries and initial intentions. On a night when wind howled around the cabin's corners like restless spirits, Martha finally spoke the truth they had both been circling. "This is no longer just our agreement, is it?" she asked quietly, her head resting against Ahiv's shoulder as they lay in the darkness. "Something has changed between us." Dawn broke crimson over the eastern hills, painting the fresh snow with blood-red light that made Martha shiver despite the cabin's warmth. "Red sky at morning, sailors take warning," she murmured, remembering her coastal childhood. Ahiv nodded grimly, already checking his rifle and the revolver he now wore constantly at his hip. The warning signs had multiplied in recent days, unfamiliar tracks circling the property perimeter, distant riders observing from ridge lines, the nervous behavior of wildlife sensing human predators in their territory. Gus Hansen had ridden to the nearest telegraph office 2 days earlier, sending messages to contacts who might offer assistance. But help would take time to arrive, if it came at all. "They will come today," Ahiv stated with quiet certainty as he studied the horizon. "The clouds moving in from the west will hide their approach and cover their tracks afterward." His assessment wasn't based on fear, but on tactical understanding. If he were planning the attack, today's conditions would be ideal. Martha moved with calm efficiency, her 6-month pregnancy now a visible proclamation of her defiance against Cold Harrow's expectations. She prepared food-filled water containers and placed ammunition boxes at strategic points throughout the cabin and barn. The weeks of preparation had transformed their home into a fortress of sorts. The first sign of approaching conflict came at mid-morning, a lone rider approaching under a white flag of truce. Sheriff Lockridge looked distinctly uncomfortable in his role as negotiator, his eyes not quite meeting Martha's, as he delivered Talbert's ultimatum. Sell the ranch immediately at half its market value or face the consequences. Lockridge said, clearly repeating Talbert's words rather than expressing his own opinion. "He says he's being generous considering your situation. Says a woman in your condition shouldn't risk violence." The sheriff's hand rested nervously on his gun belt, torn between duty and the pressure applied by the territory's wealthiest rancher. Martha's response was brief and uncompromising. "Tell Mr. Talbert he knows where my property line runs. Anyone crossing it with harmful intent will be treated as a trespasser under territorial law." Her hand rested instinctively on her belly, the other steady on the shotgun propped beside the door. By noon, the expected storm clouds had gathered, casting premature twilight across the landscape. With them came riders, at least a dozen approaching from the north, where the rolling terrain offered cover almost to the ranch buildings. Ahiv had anticipated this route, positioning their few allies accordingly behind stone walls and irrigation ditches. The attackers moved with professional coordination, spreading into a crescent formation designed to surround the ranch buildings. But Ahiv's preparations had anticipated this tactic. Hidden tripwires connected to warning bells gave advance notice of their positions, while carefully placed obstacles funneled them into predetermined killing zones. The first shots came as testing fire bullets kicking up dirt near the barn, designed to draw return fire and reveal defensive positions. Ahiv had prepared for this tactic, instructing everyone to hold steady until attackers committed themselves to closer range. The discipline paid off as the frustrated raiders pushed forward into more exposed positions. Martha positioned herself at an upstairs window, with a clear view of the eastern approach, her father's hunting rifle steady in hands, trained since childhood to bring down game at considerable distances. The pregnancy limited her mobility, but not her determination or accuracy. Gus Hansen proved his worth when the real assault began, his years as an Army sharpshooter evident in the precision of his fire from the loft. 3 attackers fell in the first exchange, causing momentary confusion in their ranks. The old blacksmith's grim expression showed no pleasure in the task, only determination to protect what he considered right. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was perhaps only 30 minutes of intense gunfire. Smoke filled the air as bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. Martha felt the baby kick violently with each rifle crack, as if the child sensed the danger surrounding its world. Then came the sound that changed everything. The distinctive war cry of Apache warriors echoing across the valley like thunder from a clear sky. A small band of mounted fighters appeared on the southern ridge, their rifles glinting in the stormlight as they swept down toward the attacking force. What no one among Talbert's men had anticipated was this arrival of unexpected reinforcements. Later, Martha would learn that Ahive had sent messages through native networks weeks earlier, calling in debts of honor from his scattered kinsmen who remembered his father's medicine and wisdom. These warriors had traveled far to answer his call, arriving at the crucial moment when the outcome hung in balance. The tide turned swiftly as Talbert's hired guns found themselves caught in crossfire from positions they hadn't identified. Professional killers fought for money, not causes, and their enthusiasm diminished rapidly when facing determined opponents willing to die for their land and family. Within minutes of the Apache arrival, the attackers began a disorganized retreat toward Cold Harrow, leaving 4 dead and several wounded behind. The ranch buildings bore scars from the gunfight, bullet holes in the walls, shattered windows, scorched earth, where muzzle flashes had ignited dry grass, but the defenders had held. Talbert himself had remained safely distant from the actual fighting, observing through field glasses from a hillside nearly a mile away. His carefully constructed alibi, a business meeting in town witnessed by prominent citizens, would shield him from legal consequences, regardless of the outcome. Or so he believed, until he turned to find Sheriff Lockridge behind him, warrant in hand, and grim determination on his weathered face. "I've been watching you for months, Orrin," the sheriff said quietly, his deputy flanking Talbert's position. "Building a case, gathering witnesses. That attack down there was the final evidence I needed." The lawman's voice carried a satisfaction that had been building through months of pressure and manipulation. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and about a dozen other charges." The weeks following the battle brought an uneasy peace to the Ellery Ranch. Talbert languished in the territorial jail, awaiting trial, his financial empire crumbling, as investors distanced themselves from the scandal. The failed attack had exposed his methods to public scrutiny, revealing years of intimidation and corruption that had gone unchallenged due to his wealth and influence. Martha's pregnancy advanced into its final months, her body growing heavier as spring breathed new life into the land around them. The cattle flourished under the innovative management system she and Ahive had developed, the herds rotating through pastures that greened with surprising vigor after their winter rest. The Apache warriors who had come to their aid remained for several weeks, their presence a deterrent against any remaining threats. These men, once strangers to Ahive, gradually accepted him back into the brotherhood he had lost, impressed by the life he had built and the respect he had earned from his white allies. Gossip in Cold Harrow gradually shifted tone, the scandal of Martha's arrangement with Ahive overshadowed by Talbert's more dramatic downfall. Sheriff Lockridge reported that opinions were slowly changing, particularly among the smaller ranchers who had long resented Talbert's stranglehold on local commerce and water rights. "They're saying now that you showed uncommon sense rather than impropriety," the sheriff explained during one of his now friendly visits. "Trading cattle for protection when you needed it most." He carefully avoided mentioning the more intimate aspects of their arrangement, though Martha's condition made those obvious to anyone with eyes. Gus Hansen established a new forge on the Ellery property, declaring himself semi-retired from town business, but available for the ranch's needs. The arrangement benefited everyone. Martha and Ahive gained a skilled craftsman and loyal defender, while Hansen enjoyed the peaceful setting and freedom from Cold Harrow's lingering prejudices. As April yielded to May, bringing wildflowers and birdsong to the high country, Martha felt the first contractions one morning while checking the kitchen garden she had planted. The baby had chosen an auspicious day, according to Ahive, the first full moon of true spring, when his people traditionally celebrated renewal and growth. Word was sent to the Navajo midwife, who had promised to attend the birth, but babies follow their own timetable. By sunset, Martha's labor had intensified beyond anyone's expectations, the child apparently as determined and impatient as its parents. Ahive remained steadfast at her side, applying knowledge passed down from his grandmother about easing a difficult birth. Night fell with Martha's cries echoing through the cabin, each contraction bringing both agony and promise. Ahiv burned sacred herbs, singing softly in his native tongue. Prayers for strength, for safe passage, for the protection of mother and child. Outside, the Apache warriors who had returned for this momentous occasion kept respectful vigil, their presence a protective circle around the new life struggling to enter the world. Near midnight, when the full moon hung directly overhead, flooding the bedroom with silver light, Martha gave a final desperate push. The child emerged into Ahiv's waiting hands, a boy with his father's copper skin and his mother's clear blue eyes, a living bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly distant just 1 year earlier. "Aunt James Ayoka Ellery," Martha whispered hoarsely when asked what name the child would carry. The first name honored her grandfather, who had originally settled this land. The second was Apache, for "he brings happiness." The combination acknowledged both lineages, both heritages that would shape the boy's future. The news traveled swiftly, reaching Cold Harrow by dawn, through the Navajo midwife who had arrived shortly after the birth. To everyone's surprise, several townspeople rode out that day, bearing gifts, baby clothes, preserved foods, even a rocking horse carved by the furniture maker's apprentice. Small gestures of reconciliation, tentative steps toward acceptance. Most unexpected was the arrival of Deacon Hurst, Bible clutched firmly as he approached the cabin, with evident discomfort. His request to bless the child reflected his struggle between dogma and compassion, between the rigid boundaries he had always preached and the undeniable miracle of new life that transcended those limitations. Ahiv watched from the doorway as the preacher awkwardly performed the Christian ceremony, understanding that this represented more than religious ritual. It was Cold Harrow's acknowledgement, however reluctant, that this child belonged to both communities. When the deacon finished, Ahiv conducted his own blessing, sprinkling sacred pollen in the 4 directions, while singing his people's ancient welcome to a new soul. The dual ceremony seemed to satisfy something in both traditions, a recognition that the child would need both sets of protections in the world he would inherit. Summer bloomed across the territory, painting the rangeland with wildflowers and the rich green of well-managed grasslands. The Ellery Ranch flourished under its unconventional stewardship, the cattle fat and healthy, the land responding to the balanced approach that combined Martha's Eastern education with Hiv's indigenous wisdom. Little James grew with astonishing speed, his mixed heritage evident in features that combined the best of both parents. By his 3rd month, he already showed his father's quiet watchfulness and his mother's determined spirit, tiny hands reaching for the world with unwavering curiosity and confidence. The legal proceedings against Talbert concluded with surprising swiftness, his financial and political influence insufficient to overcome the testimony of multiple witnesses. Sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, he was transported east under heavy guard, his empire divided among creditors and former victims of his schemes. Martha formally revised the original agreement with Ahiv, transferring half ownership of the ranch into his name through legal documents filed with the territorial court. Not payment for services rendered, she insisted when questioned by the skeptical clerk, but recognition of partnership in all things. The distinction mattered greatly to both of them. Their wedding took place on the summer solstice, conducted according to Apache tradition at dawn and Christian custom at dusk. Sheriff Lockridge stood as witness alongside Hiv's newfound kinsman. The ceremony a public declaration of what had evolved from necessity to choice, from arrangement to love. The union remained controversial in some quarters, particularly among the territory's upper echelons who feared the precedent it established. Yet for every voice raised in criticism, another spoke in defense of the couple who had stood against corruption and violence, whose determination had exposed the rot beneath Cold Harrow's respectable facade. Martha's former husband Thomas returned unexpectedly that autumn, his dance hall girl having abandoned him when his money ran out. He arrived at the ranch unkempt and desperate, seeking to reclaim what he had discarded. His shock at finding Martha not only thriving but transformed was evident in his slack-jawed stare and stuttering demands. "You have no place here," Ahiv stated calmly, standing beside Martha as they faced her past together. Their son slept peacefully in a cradleboard on Martha's back, the living embodiment of the future they had built from the ruins of their separate lives. Thomas departed as he had arrived alone, and diminished a footnote rather than a defining chapter in Martha's story. By James's first birthday, Martha had established a school on the ranch property initially intended just for their son, but quickly expanded to include children from neighboring homesteads and several Apache families who had settled nearby. Education became her passion, creating a place where different languages and traditions were valued equally. HIV's role evolved as well, his knowledge of sustainable land management drawing attention from unexpected quarters. Smaller ranchers began consulting him about water conservation and pasture rotation techniques that allowed them to compete more effectively with the territory's remaining large operations. His patient explanations bridged cultural divides that had once seemed insurmountable. The cattle that had been the foundation of their original bargain multiplied under their care, the herd growing so large that additional grazing land was required. They purchased several adjoining properties as they became available, including Talbert's former headquarters, transforming what had been a monument to greed into a community resource with fair access to water for all neighboring ranches. By the time James took his first steps across the cabin floor, rushing unsteadily from Martha's arms to Ahiv's waiting hands, the scandal of his conception had faded into legend. New settlers arriving in the territory heard different versions of the story. Some romantic, some pragmatic, all acknowledging the courage of a woman who had defied convention to create family on her own terms. On quiet evenings with their son sleeping peacefully, Martha sometimes remembered that desperate whisper that had started everything. "I'll give you all my cattle. Just make me a mother." The bargain had been fulfilled in ways neither she nor Ahiv could have imagined, creating not just a child, but a community, not just an arrangement, but a love that had transformed a territory. The Apache warriors who had come to their aid eventually established a permanent settlement on land Martha and Ahiv set aside for the purpose, creating a sanctuary where scattered survivors of different bands could rebuild their traditions while adapting to changing times. James grew up with playmates from both worlds, as comfortable in moccasins as in boots, fluent in 2 languages and 2 ways of seeing the earth. Years passed, and the boy grew tall and strong, his unique heritage making him a natural mediator between communities that had once viewed each other with suspicion and fear. The school Martha had founded became renowned throughout the territory, drawing students from hundreds of miles away to learn in an environment where diversity was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. HIV's sustainable ranching methods spread throughout the region, transforming the landscape from overgrazed wasteland to productive grassland that could support both wildlife and cattle in harmony. The water rights that Talbert had coveted so desperately were shared freely among all the valley's inhabitants, creating prosperity that benefited everyone. As the 19th century drew toward its close, Martha often stood on her porch at sunset, watching her son play with children whose grandparents had been mortal enemies. The boy who had been conceived in desperation and born into conflict now represented hope for a future where differences could be bridges rather than barriers. The bargain she had struck with the Apache warrior in her darkest hour had given her more than motherhood. It had given her purpose, love, and a legacy that would echo through generations. In defying the expectations of her time, she had created something entirely new, a family, a community, and a way of life that honored the best of all worlds.